Welcome. Today we're going to talk about suicide. There's a phrase that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. The goal of this phrase is to remind people that the pain, hopelessness, struggle that they feel has the potential to change. It's a message about hope. And unfortunately, far too many end up committing suicide, believing things will never change and that there is no reason to have hope. When I talk about committing suicide, I want to be clear that this is a group of individuals who die as a result of suicide, and that's separate from those who attempt suicide and survive. And the numbers are outstanding, or just hard to wrap your head around. Worldwide, there are over 1,000 deaths due to suicide every single day. In the US, we have over 30,000 suicides every single year, which translates into over 86 suicide deaths a day. In a given day, there might be 1,500 attempts. In a year, we see over 100,000 suicide attempts that require the person go to the emergency room for care, and another 130,000+ are so severe that not only do they end up in the emergency room for care, but they're severe enough that they have to be admitted to the hospital. This might seem shocking to you, but there are 3 suicide deaths for every 2 homicides. So think about how often you hear about a murder, and how often do you hear about suicide? The reality is there are many more suicide deaths than there are homicide deaths, and yet we almost never hear about suicide deaths. And there are some interesting trends about these deaths. One, women are more likely to attempt suicide. In fact, they're 3 times as likely to attempt suicide. But men are 4 times as likely to actually die as a result of suicide. In fact, suicide is the 8th leading cause of death for all men across all ages and all ethnicities. Why is it that more women attempt suicide but more men are successfully ending their life via suicide? There's several reasons why this might be happening. One, men typically use more lethal methods, maybe guns, car accidents, trains. The use of these lethal methods, such as guns, is increasing the likelihood that they're going to be successful. In fact, 60% of all suicides with men are gun-related. Men also are using methods that simply are successful faster. This means there's less time for someone to find them and intervene, and there's less time for there to be a successful medical intervention if they are found. Some also suggest that the societal expectations around women and caretaking may actually buffer their risk of suicide, that the need to take care of children, perhaps needs for taking care of elderly parents, actually give them a will to live despite feeling depressed and reduce their likelihood of committing suicide. Women also have typically more social support than do men. And particularly as men get older, their sources of social support often diminish, which therefore increases their risk for suicide. And 50% of all successful suicides are associated with mood disorders. Specifically, they are very likely to have depressive disorders and bipolar disorders. But interestingly, we see that their risk is higher as their depressive symptoms improve, which is often really counterintuitive to individuals. To think about this, I invite you to think back to what does a major depressive episode look like? And when people are in the depths of that depression, they may really struggle to function, struggle to think through things, plan, concentrate. They may have very, very low energy. And when they're in that state, it's very difficult to do all the things they may need to do to commit suicide. But as they slowly start to get better, particularly depending on how they're getting better, they may experience better energy and a better ability to plan and think before their deep sadness and hopelessness has gotten better, which means they have the cognitive resources and the physical energy, and they don't feel emotionally any better, and now they're more likely to complete suicide. It's important to understand who is at greatest risk for attempting suicide and for committing suicide. One, adults over the age of 65 have significantly increased rates of suicide. There can be 5,500 plus suicides a year for this age range, and 85% of those are going to be men, and 73% of those groups are likely to use a firearm. And there may be a variety of reasons for why this is happening. They may have increased physical health problems. They may have concerns that as they've gotten older, perhaps they've had a physical illness or some physical challenges that they are now becoming a burden on members of their family or people they care about, and so they want to reduce their burden on others. They also may have increased isolation, particularly if a partner has died or as they see some of their friends dying. And all of this contributes to depression, sense that it will never get better, and a sense that they don't have any other options. Even outside of elderly populations, we see that increased rates of illness, whether it's physical illness or psychological illness like depression, or other forms of isolation, for example, being divorced or widowed, increases individuals' risk. Chronic illness in general can increase risk, but this is important to clarify. It's important that we not dump together all of these individuals, because some individuals who are chronically ill and who may be facing a very painful, perhaps a protracted death where they will eventually lose the capacity to choose, may actually have what we would refer to as a rational suicide, where they proactively plan through how to end their life before the disease ends their life. This is also very common for individuals who have chronic pain and they know that their life is only going to be continuing with that level of chronic pain or worsening pain. These individuals may make a decision, and it's not because they're depressed, it's not because they're mentally ill, but they're making a rational decision to limit their suffering. We also know, as we've said already, that men have very high rates. Teens and young adults have very high rates. And specifically, there's been significant increases among African American teenagers, and Native American teenagers, particularly boys, have exceedingly high rates of suicide. In fact, looking across all groups, teen suicide rates have more than tripled over the last several decades. There are now more suicides among teenagers and young adults than deaths from cancer, heart disease, AIDS, birth defects, stroke, pneumonia, influenza, and lung disease, all put together. Here is a table that shows you the lifetime risk and the risk for both men and women across different time frames. And for each of these segments by age, the first square, the darker square, are men, and the lighter square in the second space are women. First of all, I'll draw your attention to the 5 to 15-year-old range, and that although the number of suicides among this risk is very low, there are indeed children this young that do commit suicide. At 15 to 25, we see a significant increase for both groups, but now we see a significant change in the rates of suicide for men. And from here, men show a lifelong gradual increase that then dramatically increases after age 65. For women, we see more of a normal distribution that's kind of platykurtic, meaning it's kind of flat, but you still see a rise and fall, where they have very low rates early in life and late in life, but it peaks and gets a little bit higher in middle life, and then we see another peak around 75 to 85 years of age. And what are the risk factors that are associated with suicide? One of the number one risk factors that we have to be aware of is the sense of hopelessness. If we are experiencing negative life events, but we have some confidence that they might get better, that they will change, or that they're temporary, then suicide does not feel like an option. But when individuals have these challenging life circumstances and they've come to believe that it will always look this way, it will always be this way, the future will never change for the better, then suicide starts to feel like a more reasonable response. So one, we have to be thoughtful when we see hopelessness. Individuals who have a previous suicide attempt are at higher risk. Those with illness, this is physical illness and mental illness, psychological illness. And when we typically see with mental illness and suicide are that those with higher risk are those that have a history of mood disorders, and in particular a history also of substance abuse. Higher levels of impulsivity and aggressiveness are associated with suicide. Those who have cultural or religious beliefs that suicide is somehow a more noble thing to do are at higher risk. A history of child abuse and a history of child neglect. A recent significant loss, for example, losing someone that they love dearly, perhaps losing their social status, losing a job, or losing their livelihood. Having higher rates of alienation or isolation, so they're cut off from others, they don't have that social support. Knowing others who have committed suicide, or being in a natural disaster. If you go to our D2L folder for this week, you'll see that one of the links is to audio from Jefferson Parish, and it's looking at mental health after Hurricane Katrina. And what they found is that even after all of this time, they still have higher rates of suicide calls. And even though the population is much smaller, their proportion of suicides has dramatically increased. If those are the risk factors, it's also very important that we understand the protective factors. Protective factors are factors that buffer people from the risks that are associated with increased rates of suicide. And we actually know that there are a variety of things that we can do to reduce these risks. So one, we need to ensure that there are effective methods of care for individuals who have mental health challenges, physical illness and pain, or substance abuse. That when individuals have effective treatment for any of these conditions, their rates of suicide plummet dramatically. They also need to have easy access to a variety of clinical interventions. Not every approach will work for each person, so they need to have different ways that they can seek help and that it can be easy to reach out and find that help when they want to do so. If we think about it as a general culture, we have to have a culture that is more supportive of people seeking help and getting the help that they need. Protective factors, when people have support in their family and in their community, this is support for meeting their needs. This is also social support, checking in with people, talking with people, having people invested in them. support from ongoing medical and mental health workers. So not just that check-in once a year for your physical, but having ongoing care, particularly if there are health conditions that need it. And increasing certain skill set. So individuals who get increased training and knowledge around problem solving, conflict resolution, or nonviolent ways of handling disputes are actually protected from thinking of suicide as a reasonable response to their challenges. And just like cultural or religious beliefs that support suicide, things that maybe it's noble, we can also have cultural and religious beliefs that then discourage suicide and offer support and self-preservation instincts. So when these are in place, things like, for example, God will get you through, trust in God, or that it's a sin to commit suicide, will decrease rates of suicide. There are a variety of things we might look for if we were trying to determine someone's imminent risk of suicide. And this is a strategy that is pretty easy to remember. You can think of SLAP, although I don't generally like to use something that's violent in and of itself. Another acronym is PALS, but using these can help you think through what might be the methods of determining someone's risk for suicide. And the S stands for suicidality, which this seems silly, and this is the one people always forget because it seems so silly. But when we're trying to determine someone's risk for suicide, we want to assess, are they having thoughts of suicide? Do they have thoughts of wanting to be dead? Thoughts of just death in general? Do they have thoughts of how it would be good for them to take their own life because they want to be dead? These different thoughts are meaningful, and they will differentially predict the likelihood that someone is going to try to commit suicide in the very near future. P stands for plan. Someone can have thoughts of suicide, but have no plan of how they might actually commit suicide. And that would be somebody that is lower risk than someone who's having thoughts of suicide and they've come up with a plan on how they might commit suicide. Someone who has a plan is at much higher risk that they may in the very near future actually commit suicide. A stands for accessibility. How accessible is their plan? Do they have the means for committing suicide? Are they readily available to them? For example, somebody might say, I'm going to commit suicide by stockpiling my medicine and then I'll take it all at once after I have a month's supply. Well, this can be really concerning because they have access, they have the medication, but if they have to keep gathering it every day for a month before they'll have enough, it may take them much longer. It's not readily accessible. Someone else may say, oh, well, I'm going to commit suicide and I'm going to do so by having a gun, but then you find out that they don't have a gun, they don't own a gun, they don't know how to get a gun, so they have to first figure out how to purchase the gun or acquire a gun and then how to use it and then. So in that circumstance, the method of their plan is not readily accessible, and so there's a little more time to intervene if they are seriously considering suicide. Compare that to somebody who is suicidal, they have a plan to kill themselves with a gun, and they already own a gun and know how to use it. That would be somebody who is at very, very high risk for attempting suicide and completing suicide in the extremely near future. And another important thing to consider is the lethality of their plan. Unfortunately, there are lots of ideas on how to commit suicide, but not all of them will result in death. Some of them can result in relatively minor consequences. Others may result in very significant conversations, maybe even life-altering consequences, but they still may not be able to be lethal. So we'd want to know, for example, if somebody is planning on taking pills and they have access to the pills, but the pills that they're going to take cannot kill them, that's going to be less risk than someone who has access to a pill that is known to result in their heart stopping at certain levels, and they have enough and they have it at a dose that will kill them. So going back to that example, or even the example we used earlier, if someone's suicidal with a plan, and let's say their plan is to use a gun, and they already own a gun, and we know that guns can be highly lethal, this is somebody who is at incredibly, incredibly high risk for committing suicide in the very near future. In fact, a case like that would likely be someone who I would encourage to enter into the hospital for 72 hours, a 72-hour hold, or perhaps even have them placed in the hospital for a 72-hour hold, because their risk is so incredibly high. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the other number one factor, the other piece that you definitely want to make sure that you've checked into is, do they have hope? Hope, or the lack thereof, hopelessness, is one of the best markers for suicide risk. I can have suicidal thoughts. I can have a plan for how to do it. I can have access to the means for suicide, and those means can be highly deadly. But if I have a sense of hope that things can get better and things can change, I'm far less likely to act on that plan, and far more likely not to attempt to commit suicide. I want to take a moment to also talk about the many, many myths that we have around suicide. And talking about these myths is incredibly important, because our belief in these myths about suicide lead us to responding to individuals in ways that might actually increase their risk, or at the very least not offer the protection that we could help offer individuals that we care about who may be suicidal. So what are some of these myths? One, there is an idea that suicide rates jump during the winter holidays. And this is not true. Suicide is actually lower in the winter and is highest in the spring. This may go back to the idea that depression is often worse in winter, and then people start to feel better in the spring. And as we talked about with people's risk, if they're on antidepressants, being higher as they start to get better, you might similarly have that with the springtime, they are starting to improve, their symptoms are getting a little bit better, but they still are incredibly depressed, and this is when they are actually at risk of taking their life. There's also a sense that you only see suicide among the people that are kind of really crazy. And I'll remind you that we also have the rational suicides, individuals who have painful, debilitating, not curable terminal illnesses, who make a thoughtful, planful decision to end their life in a calm and peaceful manner compared to what they'd be facing with their illness. There's also an assumption that if someone attempted suicide but they weren't successful, then they weren't serious. They were actually just trying to get attention. And along with that is this idea that if somebody is trying to seek attention, then we shouldn't do anything, because we're just going to encourage the behavior. So let's take on that first one. If someone has an unsuccessful attempt, is this attention seeking? Well, what I caution is, it may be attention seeking and it may not. Either way, we have to take it seriously. Why? Well, one, the individual may be trying to seek attention, and in being ignored, it confirms to them that there's no reason to have hope, and now they'll try again. And this time they may use a method that is guaranteed to be successful. Also, there's a lot of bad ideas about how to end your life. And someone may have an unsuccessful attempt, but that has now just taught them basically how to do it better, and taught them another method, or taught them to switch to something that has a guaranteed success. We also have a myth that if we talk about suicide, they might suddenly decide they're going to do it, or they might get an idea about it that they never had before, and so we will somehow have sparked their suicide and it wouldn't have happened otherwise. This is not true. There is no evidence that talking to someone and showing concern that you think they might be suicidal then leads to them committing suicide. In fact, having the conversation can be a piece of offering them hope and getting intervention to them that they need that will actually protect them from going through with committing suicide. There's also this idea that, well, if somebody really wants to die, they're not going to leave any clues. The reality is that when they look at people who have committed suicide or attempted to commit suicide, over 90% of them left some clues that they were planning on doing this. Now, admittedly, those clues are not always clear, and very often there are things that people only put together after the suicide attempt or the completed suicide. This might be giving away things that they really love, confirming that someone's going to take care of a beloved pet if they're no longer around anymore. Even saying things about, where are particular belongings, where is the important paperwork. These may not be clear in the moment, but they're often things that were clues to what they were thinking, and perhaps with conversation about what they were experiencing, they would have had the hope that would have led to a different decision. And the last one I'll cover is that if someone talks about suicide, then they are unlikely to go through with it, or they're just looking for attention. And this goes back to this myth of if they really want to do it, they won't leave you any clues, they won't talk about it. And hopefully I've already kind of drilled into the fact that that's wrong. If someone's talking about suicide, it's an opportunity for us to talk with them to provide some of the hope and some of the problem solving and getting to some of the professionals that can help prevent that suicide. Conversely, if someone talks about suicide and the response they get is to be ignored, or to be told that they're just seeking attention, to be treated more harshly, to be rejected, then that's likely to actually increase their risk of going forward with the suicide attempt. I share this story because, one, it's so incredibly heartwarming to me, but also because it really speaks to the power we have when we talk to someone else about their pain and we provide them with that feeling of hope that things can get better and that they are worth getting better. This shows that power of breaking past our own fears and having the conversation about suicide. And here, Highway Patrol Officer Briggs, who has been dubbed the Guardian of the Golden Gate Bridge, is talking to Kevin Berthia. And in this scene, he's 22 years old. He's suicidal. He is standing on the opposite side of the Golden Gate Bridge, which puts him at extremely, extremely high risk for jumping to his death or even falling accidentally to his death. This police officer talked with him for over an hour before Kevin was convinced that it was at least worth trying, and he agreed to climb back over the railing of the Golden Gate Bridge and not jump. And this picture is the same Kevin Berthia, but 8 years later. He made it through that moment because of that officer, and now is living a life that is thriving. Here he's presenting the officer that saved his life with an award for the American Foundation for Suicide. And at this point, he is now married and has two children. And it reminds me that suicide is always this permanent solution to a temporary problem. And given the life and times that we're in, I also want to take a moment to talk about a phenomenon that you may have heard about, but to give you a little bit more information, and that's this phenomenon of suicide by cop. By definition, this is when a suicidal individual engages in a calculated, life-threatening, and criminal behavior that they are doing to compel or to force police officers to use deadly force against them. In these killings, the initiator is a direct precipitator of his or her own death. And the result is that they've committed suicide at the hands of a police officer. If we look at the history of these individuals, we see certain patterns. So one, they have a variety of common factors. Frequently, they've already had a history of some kind of police connection. This could be that they've been arrested and had negative interactions with the police, but it may also be that they have relationships with police officers. Maybe they've tried to become a police officer or have family members that are police officers, and this leads them to having more knowledge about the procedures and decision trees that officers need to use when deciding on deadly force. They then will come up with a plan that they know will put them in contact with police officers. And because they see police officers as people that punish, they then engage in a behavior that require police to punish them with deadly force. Typically, we see that this is occurring with men. Over 98% of these cases are men. They're often young adults between 21 and 35 years old. And they see that they have typically put in a lot of thought and preparation into what they need to do in order to compel the police to kill them. Studies show that these individuals typically have a history of some kind of drug or alcohol abuse. Often there's been some history of domestic violence. Often they already are in possession of handguns or knives. And when they engage in this behavior, this is also incredibly important to understand that over half of the time, whatever they were using, whatever weapon they were using, was not lethal. This might be, for example, having a gun that was not loaded, or having a gun that they knew was not working properly, or having a gun that wasn't even real, it was a toy. In many of the cases, the person was using a toy gun, proving they had no intention of actually hurting anyone else. They just wanted a mechanism for their own death. Now this is, as you might imagine, incredibly harmful for police officers. It is traumatic for police officers to ever have to use a gun, particularly if it results in death. But that trauma response is amplified when they realize that the person was unable to do any harm, for example, it was a play gun, or when they realize that it was indeed an attempt to force them to kill them. Upon this discovery, police officers have reported a variety of things, such as being angry, to being incredibly depressed, a sense of disbelief, and also feelings of resentment. being preoccupied with the event and replaying it over and over in their head, often trying to figure out, was there something I missed, something that could have told me that this wasn't a truly violent encounter, this was someone trying to force me to kill them. Often they will have nightmares and will report hyperarousal and anxiety and even a hypersensitivity because of that hyperarousal. So suicide by cop ends up being not only devastating in that a life is lost, but then the ripple effects can go to completely change the trajectory of an officer's career and that officer's well-being and mental health. Talking about suicide and talking about how to assess for suicide is stressful. There may be things in this lecture that made you rethink past events or think about individuals that you know that may be at risk. You may even realize that thoughts you've been having have reason to be concerned. There is no reason to go at this by yourself. Whether you need to talk about how to help somebody you care about, or you need to talk about how to help yourself get past this point of struggle and feelings of hopelessness, there are many people ready to talk and ready to provide help. Whether it's for yourself or for someone else, don't do it alone. Call the Suicide Prevention Hotline at 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255. And be well.